and welcome to Lost in the Movies. This is an introductory episode for my Patreon-exclusive weekly podcast. If you're listening right now, you're either already a patron, or you're checking out the teaser video I put up on my YouTube channel. In which case, let me invite you to hop on board. We'll get to the Patreon details in a moment. First, I'd like to introduce myself and this podcast. LostInTheMovies.com has been around now for nearly a decade, although that was not the original URL. The site began in the summer of 2008 as a simple movie blog. Every day I wrote about a different film. There were no pictures, and the site was actually called The Dancing Image. I changed it officially around 2012, although that's a long story. I'll discuss this history in more depth at the end of the podcast, when I introduce a feature called Opening the Archives, reviewing my past work in chronological order week by week. I've covered a variety of topics at various times, and often at the same time, including new releases, classics, obscure titles, and TV viewing diaries. Many of you will know me primarily, or even exclusively, from my Twin Peaks coverage, including the video series Journey Through Twin Peaks. Lost in the Movies now encompasses a website, YouTube and Vimeo channels, a Twitter account, and of course this Patreon and the attached podcast you're listening to. If you haven't caught on by now, the podcast is going to be a casual, straightforward affair, a way for me to communicate with my audience directly on a regular basis. It will follow a certain structure, usually beginning with an update on my work, both the recently published and a behind-the-scenes description of other material that I'm developing, sometimes a year or more in advance of when it will go up. Today, because of the long intro describing my work, this podcast, and my Patreon system, I'll save that update for near the end of this episode. After the update, I'll focus on a particular film, probably for about 10 minutes, although sometimes I'll run longer or shorter, depending where the discussion goes. Depending on your patronage, you may be able to select some of these titles. Following the film focus, I will delve into Twin Peaks reflections, based on what I've been watching or reading and thinking about. This will segue into other topics on my mind, and hopefully, if I start getting feedback, answering listener questions, or sharing additional thoughts that you may have sent me. Each podcast will close, at least until my 10th anniversary in July, with a trip to the archives. Over 7 months, we'll move chronologically through my own blogging history. I'll highlight particular pieces from my past that I think you may enjoy, describe the overall context for where my work was during that period, and finally list all of the blog posts in a madcap race to the finish, in case one or two catches your interest. And then I'll sign off, until next week anyway. Aside from some musical cues and the occasional clip, there won't be too many bells and whistles. My setup is pretty basic, so the recording is not going to be especially high-tech. Hopefully it's not hurting your ears. And I plan to speak mostly extemporaneously, except admittedly at this moment I needed a script to follow for this introduction. In spirit, this is going to be a little more like a YouTube live stream in audio form, rather than a slickly produced podcast. Hopefully the simple approach is okay with you. It means I can do this more regularly and also still allow plenty of room for the primary work, which I opened up this Patreon to support in the first place. This podcast will be one of the perks, but there are others. For $1 a month, you're able to access updates on the Patreon blog, these weekly podcasts, and 24 hours in advance, new video essays. I know that previewing content is something that patrons seem to like a lot, so that's something I figured into each of these tiers. For $5 a month, the access to the new video essays will be a week in advance rather than a day. You can select a topic I'll cover more extensively, one of my weekly films in focus each month. When I get more than 4 patrons at this level, I'll start focusing on several films extensively each week, and the podcast will grow in length accordingly. For $10 a month, your access to completed new video essays will now be 2 weeks rather than just a week in advance. Additionally, you'll receive bi-weekly updates, either as emails or blog posts, sampling upcoming works in progress. This will include at least a couple pages of forthcoming reviews, or at least a minute of forthcoming video essays. You'll be the first to see what's in store, sometimes months ahead of time. Above those levels, I have a couple special tiers for those who are able and interested in commissioning work directly. For $50, I will create a 3.5-minute review on a film of your choice. To be clear, a 3.5-minute review is an actual video essay with clips and narration and editing and everything like that. It's not just me discussing the film, but actually doing the work to create an audio-visual essay for it. For $100, I'll create a side-by-side analysis comparing 2 works, as I did for Neon Genesis Evangelion and Twin Peaks. If you're interested in sustaining this level, I'll fulfill a similar commission each month. Now, that said, I'm well aware that Patreon is mostly made up of small contributors, and I'm thankful to anyone who can contribute at whatever level they're comfortable with. It should also go without saying you can offer other amounts too. Those are just the tiers at which certain rewards kick in. And if you can't or don't want to become a patron at all right now, your readership and viewership is still very much appreciated. Please feel free to